The bell above the convenience store door jingled a discordant tune as Lily pushed it open, a gust of warm, exhaust-tinged air ushering her inside. Her small hand, damp with a mixture of sweat and apprehension, clutched the worn, matted fur of her teddy bear, Barnaby. His single-button eye, loose in its stitching, seemed to gaze out with an equally anxious expression. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow over rows of brightly packaged snacks and sugary drinks. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee and processed pastries, did little to calm the frantic flutter in Lily's chest. Her eyes, wide and darting, scanned the narrow aisles. She was looking for him, though a part of her wished he wouldn't be there. He always seemed so impossibly large, a towering figure draped in dark leather. And there he was, near the refrigerated drinks, his back to her. A vast expanse of black leather, adorned with a formidable array of stitched patches, some embroidered with winged skulls, others with cryptic symbols. He was selecting a soda, his large hand dwarfing the can. His long, dark hair, pulled back in a neat braid, revealed the intricate tattoos winding up his neck. Lily swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Barnaby's fuzzy head pressed against her cheek as she tightened her grip. She edged along the chip aisle, pretending to be utterly engrossed in the myriad flavors, all the while keeping Steele in her peripheral vision. He paid for his soda, the crisp crackle of the dollar bill sounding surprisingly delicate in his powerful hand. He nodded curtly at the cashier, a teenage girl with bored eyes, and then turned. Their eyes met. Or rather, Lily's met his chest. Then, slowly, she tilted her head back, her gaze traveling upwards past a silver chain, a dark beard, and finally to his eyes. They were a startling shade of blue, framed by crinkles at the corners. They held a depth she couldn't quite decipher, a stark contrast to the imposing figure they inhabited. A flicker of something. Recognition. Curiosity passed through them, but his expression remained impassive. He took a long swig of his soda, the ice clinking against the can. This was her chance. She had rehearsed it 100 times in her head, whispering the words to Barnaby under her breath in the quiet of her bedroom. But now, with the reality of his imposing presence, the words felt trapped behind the lump in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging her forward, yet her feet felt rooted to the linoleum floor. The silence in the store, broken only by the hum of the refrigerators and the distant drone of traffic, amplified her internal struggle. Steele turned to leave, his boots making a soft thud against the floor. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through her fear. This was it. If he left, she wouldn't have another chance tonight, Mrs. Peterson. Mrs. Peterson needed her, taking a deep, shaky breath that tasted faintly of sugar and air conditioning. Lily found her voice, a tiny, reedy whisper that barely made it past her lips. Please. He paused, his hand already on the door handle. He looked back, his blue eyes narrowing slightly, a question in their depths. He didn't say anything, just waited. An almost unnerving stillness about him. Lily felt a fresh wave of heat rise to her cheeks. She took 2 hesitant steps forward, then another, until she was standing just a few feet from him, her gaze fixed on the intricate design of a flaming skull on his jacket. She gripped Barnaby so tightly, his stuffing probably shifted. The words tumbled out, barely audible, laced with the raw urgency of a child desperate for help. Please, she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time, though still a bare whisper. He's hurting her again. Steele's large hand dropped from the door handle. The clinking of ice in his soda can stopped. The easygoing indifference that had characterized his demeanor vanished. replaced by a sudden, intense focus. His blue eyes, previously unreadable, sharpened, locking onto her small, upturned face. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Hurting who, little one?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle despite its gravelly timbre. The words were not a question so much as a command, an expectation of an immediate and honest answer. Lily didn't hesitate. The dam had broken. She lifted a trembling hand, her small finger pointing across the street to the imposing brick apartment building that loomed against the darkening sky. From this distance, a faint, almost imperceptible sound could be heard, a muffled thud, quickly followed by a woman's stifled cry. "Mrs. Peterson," Lily breathed, her eyes wide with unshed tears. "In apartment 3B, he hurts her almost every night, and nobody helps." Her voice cracked on the last word, a raw plea that echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the convenience store. Steele followed her gaze, his expression hardening. His eyes, usually unreadable, now burned with a quiet, dangerous intensity. He listened for a moment, his head cocked slightly, his gaze fixed on the apartment building. The muffled sounds, barely noticeable to anyone not listening for them, seemed to reach him with chilling clarity. A knot of concern, stark and undeniable, tightened his features. He turned back to Lily, his eyes softening slightly as they met hers, but the underlying steel in his gaze remained. He knelt, slowly, until he was almost eye level with her, his leather jacket creaking with the movement. The action, despite his size, was surprisingly fluid, unhurried. He set his soda can on the floor beside him. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice still low, but now imbued with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Lily," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "Lily May." He nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "Lily May," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "And you're telling me this man, in apartment 3B, he's hurting Mrs. Peterson right now?" Lily nodded emphatically, a single tear finally escaping the corner of her eye and tracing a path down her cheek. "Yes, I hear her. Sometimes she screams." Her voice was barely audible, thick with emotion. "The other neighbors, they just turn up their TVs, or they pretend not to hear." Steele's jaw tightened again. He looked from Lily's tear-streaked face to the apartment building across the street, then back to her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken implications. The weight of Lily's words hung in the air, a heavy burden that Steele seemed to absorb, to carry, without flinching. His eyes, now colder than the soda he'd set down, conveyed a promise, a silent vow that the cries from apartment 3B would not go unanswered tonight. He reached out a large, gloved hand, gently taking Barnaby's paw, a silent acknowledgement of the trust Lily had placed in him. His knuckles, scarred and calloused, were a stark contrast to the small, soft toy. Lily clutched Barnaby a little tighter, a flicker of hope beginning to warm the cold knot of fear in her stomach. The plea across the street. Steele's initial surprise melted into a hard-edged stillness. His eyes, usually quick to dismiss, now held hers with an unexpected intensity. He leaned down, a deliberate movement that brought his face closer to hers, the scent of leather and something vaguely metallic filling the space between them. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, devoid of its earlier impatience. "What do you mean? He's hurting her again." Lily swallowed, her gaze darting from his piercing eyes to the worn paws of her teddy bear. The weight of her secret, of Mrs. Peterson's suffering, felt heavier now that she'd finally spoken it aloud. She pointed a small, trembling finger towards the row of apartments directly across the street from the convenience store. Even from this distance, through the thin evening air, a high-pitched cry, quickly stifled, drifted across the asphalt. It was a sound Lily knew too well, a sound that always made her stomach clench. "Mrs. Peterson," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic. "She lives there. Second floor, the window with the blue curtains." Her finger, still extended, trembled slightly. He yells at her, and then she cries out, just like that. Another sound, sharper this time, like something striking a wall, followed by a muffled sob. It was unmistakable. Steele's head tilted, his ear cocked, catching the faint, distressing symphony. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. He hadn't heard it before, hadn't been listening. Now that he was, the faint echoes were undeniably there, painting a grim picture. Lily's eyes, wide and earnest, pleaded with him. "It happens a lot, almost every night when he comes home from the bar. He gets really loud and then," she screams. Sometimes she doesn't come out for days after." A tear, unbidden, tracked a path down her cheek. "Nobody helps her. The other neighbors just turn up their TVs or pretend not to hear. I hear it, though. I can always hear it." Her voice cracked with the injustice of it all, the helplessness she'd felt watching from her own window, knowing what was happening, but being too small, too young to intervene. Steele straightened slowly, his gaze still fixed on the apartment building. The cheerful glow of the convenience store seemed to dim, replaced by a brooding shadow that emanated from him. The colorful candy displays, the rows of cheerful sodas, all faded into irrelevance. All that mattered was the faint, mournful sound echoing from across the street. He looked back at Lily, his expression now unreadable, a complex mixture of anger and something akin to a grim determination. "And you're sure it's him?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "The one yelling?" Lily nodded emphatically, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "He has a loud voice, and he drives a big noisy truck. Black. He always parks it right under her window." She pointed again, her small hand unwavering this time. "He makes her cry." The biker's eyes scanned the apartment building, picking out the second-story window with the faded blue curtains. He could almost feel the vibrations of the muffled sounds, sense the terror that must be radiating from within those walls. His hand, heavy and calloused, went to the small radio clipped to his belt. The air crackled with a sudden silent tension, a promise of impending action. The indifference that had shrouded him moments ago was gone, replaced by a dangerous, unwavering resolve. For Mrs. Peterson, and for the small, brave girl who had dared to ask for help, the night was about to change. Code red. The playful glint in Steele's eyes evaporated, replaced by a granite resolve that carved deeper lines into his already rugged face. His earlier easygoing slouch uncoiled, broad shoulders squaring as if bracing for a coming storm. His gaze, usually a soft current, now sharpened into an unblinking assessment of the world beyond the smudged convenience store window. The muffled apartment sounds, once a distant drone, pulsed with a sinister, immediate urgency. He delved into the deep pocket of his leather vest, calloused fingers closing around something substantial. Not the sleek device Lily might have expected, but a veritable brick of a phone, an archaic model with a thick antenna and buttons built for wartime. Its scuffed black casing whispered tales of untold calls, made in impossible conditions, the back secured with what looked suspiciously like duct tape, anchoring a wayward battery. He flipped it open with a practiced snap that cut through the sudden stillness of the aisle. The screen's faint glow illuminated the grim set of his jaw. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. His thumb, thick as a shortbread cookie, navigated the ancient keypad with astonishing speed, punching in a sequence of numbers that hummed with unspoken gravity. Lily watched, spellbound by the metamorphosis, the chilling efficiency of it all. The patient listener had vanished, supplanted by someone cold, precise, and utterly dangerous. He lifted the phone, eyes still locked on the apartment building, as if he could bore through its walls with sheer force of will. A moment of silence stretched, punctuated only by the low hum of fluorescent lights and a distant, almost imperceptible thud from across the street. Then a low rumble vibrated in Steele's chest, a sound born from deep within his very core. "Ghost," he rasped, his voice stripped of its usual gravelly warmth. It was a command, not a greeting. "We have a code red." Lily's breath hitched. Code red. The words hung heavy, laden with unspoken catastrophe, hinting at an emergency far beyond her grasp. She instinctively recoiled, eyes wide, a shiver tracing her spine. The stark simplicity of the phrase, coupled with Steele's tone, painted a vivid picture of dire consequence. "Affirmative," Steele continued, his gaze narrowing, picking out details Lily hadn't even registered. A curtain's flicker, a shifting shadow in a window. "Sector 3, Unit 3B, repeat, 3B. He paused, listening, his massive frame utterly immobile. The silence on the line seemed to amplify the tension in the convenience store. Lily envisioned Ghost, absorbing the information, the words, "Code Red," undoubtedly triggering an immediate, pre-programmed response. "The girl's account is solid," Steele added, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial murmur. He cast a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance at Lily, a silent acknowledgement of her crucial role. Muffled sounds confirmed. Pattern of abuse established. He's cornered her. The final words were laced with unbridled fury, a quiet promise of retribution that raised the hairs on Lily's arms. Another pause. Steele nodded slowly, a single, decisive dip of his head. "Understood. Full deployment. All exits secured. Containment, not engagement, until my arrival. Nobody in, nobody out. And for Christ's sake, no heroes. Ghost. I want this clean." His voice carried an edge that spoke of past complications, of lessons learned the hard way. He waited, listening for a final confirmation. "Roger that. ETA. 10 minutes, over and out." Steele snapped the phone shut with the same decisive movement he'd used to open it. He slid it back into his pocket, his movements economical, deliberate. The quiet efficiency of the exchange was bone-chilling. He offered no explanation, no elaboration. He simply acted. The casual air he'd worn earlier was utterly gone, replaced by a focused intensity that radiated outward, filling the small convenience store. He turned to Lily, his expression still grim, but a flicker of that earlier protective warmth returned to his eyes, momentarily softening their hard edges. "Lily," he said, his voice still low but no longer laced with the metallic taste of command, "you stay here. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Understand?" His tone brooked no argument, no childish protests. Lily simply nodded, her throat tight, her mind reeling. The implications of Code Red, of full deployment, of all exits secured, were slowly dawning on her. This wasn't just a biker coming to the rescue. This was something far more organized, far more powerful. She had stumbled into something vastly larger than she could have ever imagined, a hidden world operating just beneath the surface of the ordinary. And in the center of it all stood Steele, a man of surprising depth and even more astonishing influence. He gave her one last piercing look, a silent instruction to obey. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and strode towards the door. The bell above the entrance jingled once, a surprisingly delicate sound in the wake of the powerful force that had just passed through. Steele was gone, leaving Lily alone in the quiet convenience store, the faint echoes of Code Red reverberating in her ears, and the terrifying realization that the world had just become a much more dangerous and perhaps a much more just place. The gathering storm, the digital silence of the archaic phone, now clutched in Steele's hand, was suddenly shattered by a low, insistent thrum. It wasn't a sound from within the apartment, but from somewhere far off, a vibrational whisper against the concrete heart of the city. Lily, still huddled on the floor, flinched, her gaze darting to the window. Steele, his jaw tight, merely nodded, a grim satisfaction playing on his lips. He moved to the small, grimy window, peering out, his silhouette momentarily eclipsing the dim streetlight beyond. The distant hum intensified, shedding its whisper for a deep, resonant growl. It was a sound that didn't just register in the ears, but in the bones, a primal rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards. Lily's breath hitched. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising crescendo. Steele didn't answer directly. His focus remained fixed on the street below, his eyes scanning the empty tarmac with an unnerving intensity. The initial rumble was no longer singular. It was multiplying, a symphony of powerful engines approaching. The air outside began to thicken, heavy with the scent of gasoline and exhaust, even before the vehicles themselves became visible. Then, the first headlight cut through the urban twilight, a single piercing beam followed by another, and another, until the entire block was awash in a shimmering wave of light. Like a dark, fluid entity, dozens of motorcycles poured onto the street, their engines roaring, a collective challenge to the night. They were not merely passing by. They were converging, a relentless tide of chrome and leather. Each machine was a formidable beast, its rider a shadow cloaked in the uniform of the road. Thick leather jackets, some adorned with faded patches, sturdy boots, and the occasional glint of silver from a chain or buckle. They moved with a practiced, almost synchronized precision, their formation tightening as they swarmed the block. The street, moments ago deserted, now pulsed with a raw, untamed energy. The lead bike, a massive cruiser with a custom-painted tank, pulled to an abrupt stop directly in front of the apartment building's main entrance. Its rider, a broad-shouldered man whose helmet obscured his features, dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his imposing stature. He gestured with a gloved hand, and the other bikers responded instantly. They began to fan out, their machines weaving through the confined space with surprising agility. One by one, they positioned their motorcycles, not haphazardly, but with a deliberate, strategic intent. The roar of the engines softened to a low, idling thrum as each biker cut their power, but the sheer volume of their presence remained overwhelming. Within minutes, the apartment building was completely encircled. Bikes were parked bumper to bumper, lining the curb, blocking the alleyways, and even partially obstructing the narrow pedestrian paths. The front entrance, the fire escapes, the back stairwell, every potential exit was sealed off, not by barricades of steel, but by a wall of roaring machines and silent, watchful men. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a sense of an invisible net being cast. Steele, still at the window, turned from his vantage point, His expression was unreadable, a mix of satisfaction and something akin to quiet pride. "They're here," he stated, his voice low, almost a murmur against the lingering reverberation in the air. Lily, her small face pale, stared at the spectacle below. The intimidation was palpable, a silent threat that permeated the building's thin walls. She watched as one of the bikers, a man whose frame seemed to fill the entire pavement, removed his helmet. It was Ghost. His face, usually a study in calm reserve, held a steely resolve. He surveyed the building, his gaze methodical, before meeting Steele's eyes through the window, offering a brief, almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear. The perimeter was secured. The storm had arrived, and it had brought with it an unyielding stillness. Trapped. The sharp crack of Mr. Grumble's hand against Mrs. Peterson's cheek echoed in the small apartment, a familiar punctuation mark in their daily routine. Her head snapped back, a whimper catching in her throat, quickly swallowed. He leaned in, his face a mottled mask of rage, spittle flecking his chin. "You think you can just look at me like that?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "After all I do for you, you ungrateful wretch." Mrs. Peterson kept her eyes fixed on the worn linoleum, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Each word was a physical blow, each accusation a fresh bruise on her already battered spirit. She tasted blood, coppery and metallic, from the corner of her mouth. Her hands trembled, clasped tightly in her lap, as if to hold herself together. Before Mr. Grumbles could deliver his next verbal assault, a low thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a distant, almost imperceptible tremor at first, like a restless beast stirring in its sleep. He paused, his brow furrowed in annoyance, his tirade momentarily forgotten. "What in the blazes is that?" he muttered, more to himself than to Mrs. Peterson. The thrum grew, deepening into a guttural growl that resonated through the very bones of the building. It wasn't a single sound, but a symphony of raw power, a chorus of engines revving in unison. The window panes began to rattle, a nervous clatter against the rising roar. Mr. Grumbles' eyes darted to the window, his expression shifting from irritation to a flicker of genuine confusion. This wasn't the usual street noise, the occasional passing car, or the distant wail of a siren. This was bigger, more insistent. He lumbered to the window, pushing aside the threadbare curtain with a jerky motion. His breath hitched. Down below, the street, usually a mundane stretch of cracked asphalt and parked cars, was transformed. A sea of black leather and chrome had swallowed it whole. Dozens, no, scores of motorcycles, each a gleaming, snarling beast, were parked shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable barricade. Their engines idled, a collective thunder that vibrated through the glass and into his chest. His gaze swept across the scene, a slow, dawning horror spreading across his face. The bikes weren't just on his street. They encircled the entire building. Every entrance, every alleyway, every possible escape route was blocked by a hulking figure perched atop a roaring machine. They were like a silent, ominous army, their faces obscured by helmets or shadowed by the brims of bandanas. He couldn't make out individual features, just the collective, unwavering stare of 100 unseen eyes. A cold dread seeped into Mr. Grumbles' gut. He wasn't just looking at a nuisance. He was looking at an encirclement, a siege. His mind, usually so quick to conjure excuses and deflections, was suddenly blank. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his composure. He tried to think, to rationalize, but the sheer number of them, The deliberate precision of their formation defied any simple explanation. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. He backed away from the window, stumbling over his own feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound of the engines, though muffled by the glass, still permeated the apartment, a constant, menacing reminder. He glanced around the cramped living room, his eyes wild, searching for an exit, a way out. But there was nowhere to go. The fire escape? Too high, too exposed. The back door. It led to an alley, which he now realized was just as thoroughly blocked as the front. His breath hitched again, this time a strangled gasp. He was trapped. Utterly, completely trapped. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away his bluster, revealing the raw, quivering fear beneath. He was no longer the imposing figure in his own apartment. He was a rat in a cage, surrounded by an unknown, unyielding force. The silence from Mrs. Peterson, who still sat frozen on the couch, seemed to amplify his growing terror. He could feel the weight of those unseen eyes, pressing in, closing around him. The roar of the motorcycles wasn't just noise. It was a promise of something he couldn't escape. The silent wall. The collective growl of engines finally died, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. No angry shouts, no revving of throttles, just the low thrum of cooling metal and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the city. The bikers, a formidable phalanx of leather and chrome, remained mounted, their figures silhouetted against the streetlights. They were a silent wall, an unyielding barrier that sealed off the apartment building with a chilling efficiency. Each man, a statue of dark resolve, faced inward, eyes scanning the exits, the fire escapes, the very air around the structure. The message was clear, etched in their unmoving posture. No one entered, and no one left. Inside, Mr. Grumbles' terror had congealed into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He peered through the blinds, his face a sickly pale beneath the fluorescent kitchen light. The sight of the hundreds of motorcycles, arranged with such precision, their riders unmoving, was more terrifying than any direct threat. He was trapped, utterly and unequivocally, by an unspoken decree. The silence was the most potent weapon, amplifying the frantic thumping of his own heart. Oh, from the darkened doorway of the convenience store, Lily watched, her small face pressed against the cool glass. The scene unfolding across the street was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The bikers, once a blur of motion, were now a fixed, unblinking presence. She recognized the sheer scale of their commitment, the way they held the street in a silent chokehold. It wasn't violence, not yet, but something far more absolute. It was a promise, made manifest. She could almost feel the weight of their collective will, pressing down on the building, on Mr. Grumbles, on the injustice he had so casually perpetuated. Steele, dismounted and standing on the sidewalk, his large frame a solid anchor amidst the silent storm, pulled out his phone. His fingers, surprisingly delicate for their size, tapped out a number. The caller ID glowed briefly, illuminating the stern lines of his face. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, devoid of any panic or urgency, yet imbued with an unmistakable authority. "Officer Ramirez, this is Steele. We have a situation at 347 Elm Street." He paused, listening to the crackle on the other end. No one's been hurt on our end. Yet, it's an intervention. We've got the building secured. The individual responsible for the ongoing domestic disturbance, Mr. Grumbles, is currently confined within his apartment, Unit 4B. He won't be going anywhere. There was another pause, a longer one this time, as Officer Ramirez clearly processed the audacious statement. Steele's gaze swept over his men, a silent acknowledgement of their unwavering resolve. Not a single head turned. They were statues of intent. How secured, exactly? Officer Ramirez's voice, though professional, held a note of wary curiosity. Completely, Steele replied, his tone unwavering. Every exit, every window above ground floor, every potential escape route is covered. Discreetly, mind you. No property damage, no direct confrontation. Just a presence. We are merely ensuring the individual in question remains available for your questioning. He allowed a brief, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. Consider it a community watch initiative, albeit one with a slightly larger footprint than usual. Lily, still observing, felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. A strange mix of fear and exhilarating hope. The quiet strength radiating from Steele and his men was palpable. It wasn't just the bikes, or the leather, or the sheer numbers. It was the unshakable certainty in their collective posture. They had moved from a whisper to a roar, and now to an unyielding silence that spoke volumes. The injustice that had festered in the building for so long was finally being addressed, not with chaos, but with an almost terrifying order. And the victim, Officer Ramirez's voice cut through Steele's thoughts. Mrs. Peterson, Steele supplied, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. She's still inside, we believe. Unharmed, as far as we know, since our arrival. Our priority now is ensuring her safe extraction. We recommend a discreet entry, possibly through the rear, to avoid any unnecessary escalation. He concluded the call with a final, firm instruction. We'll maintain our position until your units arrive, officer. You'll know us by our distinctive attire. He hung up, the click echoing in the sudden silence. He stood for a moment, absorbing the quiet resolve of his club, the subtle tension in the air. The trap was sprung, the net cast. Now they waited for the system to catch up to the justice they had so meticulously orchestrated. The night, once dark with despair, was now illuminated by the silent, unyielding presence of the Iron Horsemen. Arrival of the authorities. The wail of sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, sliced through the pre-dawn hush. It was a sound Steele knew well, a familiar overture to the chaos he usually tried to avoid. Tonight, however, he welcomed it. He watched as the first patrol car, its blue and red lights painting the street in a strobe-like flicker, rounded the corner. Then another, and another. Soon, half a dozen black and whites lined the street, their flashing lights casting dancing shadows on the parked motorcycles and the stoic faces of his crew. Officer Ramirez killed the engine of her cruiser, the sudden silence heavy after the cacophony of the sirens. She took a deep breath, the stale scent of exhaust and damp asphalt filling her lungs. Her eyes, tired from an overnight shift that had already included a bar brawl and a stolen catalytic converter, scanned the scene. This was unexpected. Dozens of motorcycles, gleaming chrome and matte black, formed an almost unbroken perimeter around the apartment building, and on each bike, or leaning against it, was a figure draped in leather, patches glinting faintly in the flashing police lights. No shouting, no aggression, just an unnerving stillness. Well, this is new, her partner muttered from the passenger seat, his hand already resting on his sidearm. Ramirez ignored him, her gaze fixed on the imposing figure at the head of the blockade. Even from a distance, The man exuded an aura of quiet authority. He stood beside a particularly formidable-looking Harley, his broad shoulders filling out a cut that bore the ominous inscription, Iron Horseman MC. This wasn't some impromptu protest. This was orchestrated. She exited the cruiser, her hand instinctively going to her own weapon, though she kept it holstered. Her training kicked in, the immediate assessment of a potential threat. Yet, there was no hostility in the air, only a palpable tension. As she approached, Steele stepped forward, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his bandana. "Officer," he rumbled, his voice a low growl that carried surprising weight. "Glad you could make it." Ramirez stopped a few feet away, her eyes flicking from Steele to the other bikers, then to the darkened windows of the apartment building. "You called this in?" she asked, her tone even, betraying none of her surprise. The dispatcher had simply reported a domestic disturbance and an anonymous tip about a community watch in progress. This was beyond community watch. "We did," Steele confirmed, a slight nod of his head. "Mrs. Peterson, apartment 3B. Mr. Grumbles is inside. He's been disruptive." His gaze, though direct, held no challenge, only a steely resolve. "Disruptive how, exactly?" Ramirez pressed, her jaw tightening. She'd heard that euphemism before. "Enough that a child felt the need to involve us," Steele replied, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Ramirez studied him for a long moment, taking in the myriad tattoos, the weathered leather, the sheer physical presence of the man. He wasn't just some random thug. There was a deliberate, almost surgical precision to this entire operation. She looked back at her team, who were now fanning out, their hands hovering over their weapons, mirroring her own initial caution. This wasn't the usual drug deal gone wrong or gang shootout. This was different. "All right," she said finally. "My team will secure the perimeter. We'll handle it from here." She paused, then added, "And you all. You stay put. Any interference and this becomes a very different situation." Steele simply met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Understood, officer. We're not going anywhere." Ramirez gave a curt nod, then turned to her team. "Officer Miller, you and Rodriguez stay out here. Keep an eye on our newfound community leaders, the rest of you, with me. Let's go." She led her officers towards the entrance of the building, the heavy door creaking open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of old cooking and something else, something metallic and acrid. With flashlights cutting through the gloom, they moved swiftly, their boots thudding softly on the worn linoleum. The silence of the bikers outside was replaced by the hushed tension of a police entry. Up the stairs they went, their eyes sweeping each landing, each door. Apartment 3B. Ramirez approached, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. She knocked firmly. "Police! Open up!" A muffled sound from within, then a harsh male voice. "Who is it? Go away!" Ramirez exchanged a glance with her team. This was it, the moment of truth. Outside, Steele stood motionless, a sentinel in the pre-dawn light, listening to the faint sounds of the authorities finally taking action. The silence of his crew was absolute, their collective gaze fixed on the apartment building, a silent, unyielding presence that ensured no one would leave until justice, however it was meted out, had run its course. Rescue and arrest. A new kind of tension, lighter but no less potent, settled over the courtyard. The air, previously thick with unspoken threats and simmering anticipation, now hummed with a fragile hope. Then, the heavy glass doors of the apartment building parted, and two uniformed officers emerged, carefully escorting a small, stooped woman. Mrs. Peterson, her face a roadmap of recent distress, blinked against the afternoon light. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and a faint bruise bloomed like an ugly flower on her cheekbone. Yet, despite the visible signs of her ordeal, a flicker of profound relief softened the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She clutched a worn handbag to her chest, as if it contained the sum of her worldly comfort. Steele, from his vantage point on the lead hog, watched her with an intensity that belied his usual impassive demeanor. He saw the weary sag of her shoulders, the tentative steps, and felt a surge of cold satisfaction. Justice, in this quiet, unconventional form, was being served. Officer Ramirez, walking a step behind, Mrs. Peterson offered a reassuring word, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the distant rumble of the idling motorcycles. The other residents, who had been drawn to their windows by the unusual spectacle, watched in silent awe. They saw not a criminal being led away, but a neighbor, a victim, finally finding a path to safety. Mrs. Peterson's gaze swept across the courtyard, past the watchful faces of the residents, past the imposing line of bikes. She didn't meet Steele's eyes directly, but a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of a shared understanding. She was led to a waiting patrol car, its doors opening like a sanctuary, and she disappeared inside, leaving behind a palpable sense of closure. The air shifted again, tightening with the expectation of the next act. It wasn't long before the doors swung open once more. This time, Mr. Grumbles was pushed out, his hands cuffed behind his back, his earlier bravado replaced by a sullen resentment. He was a man accustomed to wielding petty power within the confines of his home, and now that power had evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. His eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual disapproval, darted around, betraying a flicker of fear. Two officers flanked him, their grips firm on his arms. As they guided him across the pavement, Mr. Grumbles caught sight of the silent phalanx of bikers. His jaw, which had been set in a stubborn line, slackened. His gaze swept over the chrome and leather, the unyielding faces beneath the helmets, the sheer, overwhelming presence of so many men who clearly meant business. The anger that had fueled him for so long seemed to drain away, replaced by a chilling realization of his predicament. He stumbled slightly, his bravado finally crumbling under the weight of their collective silent judgment. Steele watched him, his expression unreadable. He saw the man's fear, the way his eyes widened slightly as he took in the sheer number of bikers, the way his shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink into himself. There was no triumph in Steele's gaze, only a grim satisfaction that the immediate threat had been neutralized. The bikers remained motionless, a solid wall of quiet menace, their eyes following Mr. Grumbles' slow, ignominious walk. No shouts, no jeers, just an unbroken, unwavering stare that communicated more effectively than any words. It was a silent condemnation, a community's collective disapproval made manifest. Mr. Grumbles was shoved into the back of a second patrol car. The door slammed shut with a definitive thud, severing his connection to the world he had terrorized. The engine idled for a moment. Then the police cars, one carrying a weary victim, the other a cowed abuser, slowly pulled away from the curb. As they drove off, the tension in the courtyard began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet hum of relief. The blockade, for now, had served its purpose. Steele raised a hand, and the low rumble of the idling engines softened, a signal that the immediate crisis was over. But the consequences, he knew, were just beginning. Fading rumbles. The flashing blue and red lights painted the street in fleeting stark contrasts. But now, only the steady white glow from the squad cars remained. The last police cruiser, its rear tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder, had just vanished around the bend, taking Mr. Grumbles and his shattered bravado with it. A quiet satisfaction settled over the assembled bikers, a shared understanding that justice, in their own unique form, had been served. Steele, still astride his gleaming black Road King, watched the empty space where the cruiser had been. His gaze was distant, thoughtful. The heavy thrum of his engine was a low, comforting heartbeat beneath him. He didn't need to issue a command. The signal was implicit in the air, in the subtle shifts of weight, the almost imperceptible nods exchanged between patched figures. This wasn't a military operation, but their cohesion was just as potent. Ghost, a silhouette against the muted glow of a distant street lamp, moved first. His boots crunched on the asphalt as he walked to his own bike, a shadow phantom that seemed to absorb all ambient light. He swung a leg over, the leather of his jacket creaking softly, and his engine coughed to life, a low, guttural growl that quickly settled into a steady idle. It was a sound that spoke of power contained, a beast held on a leash. One by one, the other engines began to rumble, a growing symphony of mechanical might. It wasn't a raucous roar, but a measured, respectful awakening, a collective sigh of relief and purpose. The street, which had been so unnervingly quiet during the standoff, now vibrated with this emergent power. Headlights flickered on, cutting through the residual gloom of the pre-dawn hour, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. Steele finally shifted, pulling his gaze from the now empty street. He glanced at Ghost, who met his eyes with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. No words were needed. Ghost understood the silent language of their brotherhood, the unwritten rules of their unique brand of justice. He was a shadow, efficient and reliable, always there when needed, fading away just as silently. With a final, lingering look at the apartment building, its windows now dark and silent, Steele revved his engine once, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. It was a signal, a wordless, "Let's go." He eased off the clutch, his massive bike rolling forward with a low, powerful hum. The procession began, not in a thundering charge, but in a measured, disciplined retreat. Each rider, one after another, pulled away from the curb, their headlights carving paths through the darkness. The growl of their collective engines grew louder for a moment, a wave of sound that washed over the quiet neighborhood, then began to recede. Steele led the way, his broad shoulders a formidable silhouette against the emerging pale gray of the eastern sky. Ghost followed a few bikes back, a dark, silent presence, his gaze sweeping the street, ensuring no loose ends, no lingering disturbances. The other club members fell in behind him, a disciplined wedge of chrome and leather, their presence an undeniable force. The rumbles began to fade, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as they turned the corner, heading away from the scene of their intervention. The individual growls of engines merged into a receding hum, a distant, almost melodic throb that gradually dissolved into the stillness of the approaching dawn. The streetlights, which had seemed so muted earlier, now cast a lonely glow on the empty street. The air, once thick with the scent of exhaust and the charged tension of the blockade, began to clear. The faint aroma of damp earth and distant wood smoke replaced the metallic tang of gasoline. The silence, which had been broken so dramatically just hours before, slowly returned, deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of a street that had witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied conventional understanding. Only the faint, lingering scent of oil and gasoline on the cool morning air remained. A ghost of their presence. The street returned to its slumber, but not quite the same as before. A ripple had been sent through its quiet veneer, a testament to the fact that sometimes justice wore leather and roared on two wheels. The fading rumbles were not just the sound of motorcycles departing. They were the echoes of a community awakened, a silent promise of protection, and the indelible mark of Steele's quiet, dangerous resolve. Unexpected heroes. The last rumble of engines dissipated into the night's hush, leaving behind an unfamiliar tranquility. Perched on the curb beside Steele, Lily shivered, though not from cold. A profound current of relief, like a long-held dam finally breached, surged through her. The vice-like grip that had cinched her chest for months now slackened. She watched the final taillight vanish around the bend, a dwindling crimson spark against the urban sprawl. Steele remained a silent, granite sentinel, his gaze fixed on the apartment building's now darkened windows. "He's gone," Lily breathed, the words feeling feather-light and alien on her tongue. She looked up at Steele, his face a landscape of sharp angles and shadows under the dim streetlight. There was no glint of triumph or satisfaction in his expression, only a quiet, almost bone-deep resolve. Yet, in that moment, he transcended the image of a large, formidable man on a motorcycle. He was something far more. She recalled the shrill cries that once tore through their nights, the pervasive dread that settled over their small community whenever Mr. Grumbles was home. The helplessness was a palpable weight, the way neighbors would hastily draw their curtains, the way even the police, after a few cursory visits, seemed to surrender to the relentless cycle. But tonight, the script had flipped. Tonight, a girl's whispered plea had ignited a quiet revolution. Steele offered no verbal reply, but a subtle shift in his massive frame, turning towards her, spoke volumes. It was a slight movement, yet Lily felt its gravity, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, her past terror, and now her burgeoning fragile hope. It dawned on her then that heroes didn't always don capes or gleaming badges. Sometimes they wore worn leather vests, their arms a canvas of tattoos, their faces etched with untold narratives. You saved her," Lily said, her voice still reedy but gaining an insistent strength with each syllable. Steele rumbled, a low, guttural sound from his chest. "We kept her safe." The distinction resonated deeply with Lily. They hadn't charged in, delivering their own rough-hewn justice. They had simply been there. Their collective presence, a silent, unyielding barricade of leather and chrome, had been the catalyst. It had forced the issue, made it impossible to overlook. It was a different kind of power, one that bypassed violence in favor of sheer, unshakable will. Officer Ramirez emerged from the building, her expression a blend of exhaustion and pensive contemplation. She halted a few feet away, her eyes sweeping over Steele before settling on Lily. "Mrs. Peterson is safe. Her sister's en route to pick her up. She'll be staying with her for a while." A wave of relief, so potent it left Lily lightheaded, washed over her. Mrs. Peterson, with her perpetually downcast eyes and hushed voice, was finally unburdened. "Thank you, officer," Lily managed, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. Ramirez nodded, a faint echo of a smile touching her own. "No, Lily. Thank you." She glanced at Steele, an unreadable flicker in her gaze. "And thank you. All of you." It was a quiet endorsement, yet it hung in the air, thick with unspoken understanding. Ramirez, a woman who had witnessed humanity's bleakest corners, comprehended the unique intervention that had unfolded. She understood that sometimes the traditional system required a nudge. A very substantial, very intimidating nudge. Lily looked at Steele once more. He wasn't a man of many words, that much was clear. His communication lay in his actions, in the unwavering focus he'd demonstrated since she'd first confided her fear to him at the convenience store. He had taken her whispered plea and forged it into a powerful collective declaration. The bikers, his club, were not merely a gang. They were a community, bound by their own distinct code, capable of extraordinary feats. This wasn't just about Mrs. Peterson anymore, Lily realized. This transcended individual plight. It was about what happened when people, even improbable ones, united to shield the vulnerable. It was about redefining the very essence of community safety. It wasn't simply a matter of waiting for the authorities. It was about active, collective engagement, about individuals embracing responsibility for their neighbors, even if those neighbors were strangers. The street was utterly still now, the earlier tension replaced by a quietude that felt almost consecrated. The air, though still carrying the faint echo of exhaust fumes, felt cleansed, lighter. Lily stood, her legs a touch unsteady. She sensed a profound internal shift. The timid girl paralyzed by fear was still present, but now she was infused with new understanding, a nascent spark of hope. They were heroes, Lily stated, looking at Steele, her voice now steady and resolute. Steele finally met her gaze, and in his eyes, Lily saw something unexpected. A flicker of comprehension, a shared burden lifted, and perhaps, just perhaps, a quiet pride. He neither denied it nor deflected. He simply held her gaze, a silent testament to the night's extraordinary events. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but in this small corner of it, a new paradigm for intervention, a fresh understanding of collective power, had been forged. And it had all begun with a whisper, and a biker who chose to listen.